Hello. The next session would be easier for me to demonstrate on the mannequin. Just to go through what actually you have to be done by this point is, as you see, so I attached my facing to the shoulders and canvases, move over my lining, and you've got your collar here still got with the seam allowance. Check your canvases, so make sure they are all laying flat, and your linens, and that is the back of your coat. Okay, sometimes you need to check that area as well, because when you put your lining, it creates the bump. So you need to make sure it's a nice and smooth. Okay. And if you do wish to trim in certain places, you can, to create that smooth line. But that's what you should have. The next stage would be to trim a little bit of your seam allowance around the neckline. So at the moment about 2.5, so I'm going to cut it to 2 centimeters. So you can measure. So I'm going to cut that so you can see as well. I'm very sorry, my hand is in the way. It's quite hard to do. It's hard to demonstrate that part. There we go. So I trimmed that, and also I'm going to snip in 2 places, here and there. That's it, to release that fabric. Although this fabric is quite forgiving, very nice wool, so it can be stretched. But nevertheless, it's good for you to remember that actually those bits need to snip a little bit. So the next part would be is to smooth your lining around the shoulders, and then bring the other lining up. Okay, and fold your seam allowance. So here, so I'm just going to steam that a little bit so you can see better what I do. That's it. So now you can have your stitching, so you should stitch your collar through the layer, so make sure, and then you can see your stitchings here. So I still got my tucking in the line, so you can see better. But yes, all been stitched through. So if you followed my color, so you should have that. So when you've done that, you fold, you bring your lining. Lining should be attached. If not, then again you need to reattach your lining again. So you know how much seam allowance you will need to use. And pretty much my one is where I use it. I have to use all of them. Sometimes it's left quite a lot, then you can obviously cut your seam allowance, but before you cut, check your lining, make sure it sits properly. So my one has been used more, and so you're going to keep all my seam allowance there, fold it underneath, so following, see the white tucking, so my also stop stitching here as well, so following my stop stitching around the neckline, and I'm going to pin lining following the neckline, so the same shape, so you create the same shape to that, and then it goes to your facing, and it goes about 2.5 centimeters. Yeah, so you follow that. So in some parts, when I followed my seam allowance there, so I just followed the neckline, and if you see, where it's been folded is here is more seam allowance I use it, but here it comes to less. That's because, see that? That's because I have to follow, and that's it opens here more. So that's absolutely fine. So as long as you've got enough seam allowance to do that. So, oops. There we go. Now I'm going to literally fold it there over. So in case if I just fold your seam allowance over. Both sides. So you find the happy medium here, so they both have a similar length, and then you need to pin that. And remember your shoulder, the lining would be slightly bigger, about 1 centimeter. Try to distribute that amount of the fabric because it's quite important. But, you know, if your shoulder itself is too big, then of course, you know, just use your judgment and make it smaller, because you don't want it to be ruched either. So all need to be nice and smooth. There we go. So the next part would be is to tack these lines and then hand stitch that line for of your lining. So I'm going to do that in a minute. In the meantime, just want you to pay, you know, you have attention to the armhole. And as you see, you've got some places I've got personally. If I just drop my camera, that's it. I've got quite lots of seam allowance here, lots of lining, because as you see, so my seam allowance finished there, and I've got a lot. In order for me to cut my lining, before I do that, first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to tuck my lining into my armhole, and that also helps to apply the sleeve. So in my seam allowance here, about, like I said, about, you know, 1 centimeter, so you can hold it and just tuck that lining together, but tack this first, so you don't have to tack your shoulders and neckline first. You don't have to, you know, so come back to that. But I just want to show you that first before I go to next step. Okay, so you continue. So you put your hand inside, and then you continue attaching. I do apologize, my hands in the way, so it's quite hard for me to do. So I'm sorry, I need to have to do it. So see what I'm doing? So trying to follow my armhole seam allowance. So I'm attaching it, that's to seam allowance. Your underarm. There we go. So you can feel where your seam allowance, take your time. You can feel where your seam allowance there. And you're attaching it to seam allowance. There we go. So I'm just going to leave that thread here, because I'm going to tuck my shoulders and the neckline. But okay, but in the meantime, can you see that you've got plenty of the lining here? And I'm going to now trim that, because that will stop the lining. Sometimes will stop the movement of the sleeve. So that's important to do that. So I'm just following again, and I'm trimming to the seam allowance. There we go. So continue. Be careful you don't snip your sleeve lining, so you please put your hand inside. I can't stress enough how you have to be really careful with all this cutting seam allowance and cutting the lining. And if you need it to cut in stages, so you know exactly what you're doing. Because imagine if you just snip your lining, the sleeve line, or your top fabric, you know, there's no way you can redo that now. So it's very important to be cautious about the stuff. Okay. There we go. So I will correct it in a minute, which will be easier for me to reach to the lining. But I hope you understand the principle of that. So now, can you see that? So cut all my, and opened my armhole as well. See, and I put the basting line to help me to know where exactly my seam is, which helps me with uh, the lining for the sleeve. You see that? And then I'm going to check again what needs to be done, and then I'm going to tack along the shoulder line, along the neckline, hand stitch that line first before I put my sleeve lining around the armhole. So I'm going to show you all that in the next video, so how I'm applying the lining, how I'm finishing the armhole with the lining. Okay, I'll see you next video. Bye.